Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to be with you, no matter where you are, whether it be, far or near, no matter what time zone. Isn't it lovely that we can all just be together like this? And also, I want to say thank you and hello to my friends in the Christian Science Church, the second church in Newport Beach, California, beautiful Newport Beach. Over the last few months, I've got to know them and work together with them, and they're just the loveliest people. So I do thank them for the privilege of getting to know them, but also for this time that they have allowed us to be together today, to just sit quietly and be still, to maybe regain some of that peace of mind that does seem to just so fluctuate a bit at the moment. Because frankly, doesn't the world seem a rather strange and unsettled place? It would seem that the things that we've always held traditionally to be supporting our communities, our economies, our lives, just don't seem to be able to support us like they used to. Things like our government institutions, our businesses and jobs, our homes, even our health, all seem at the moment, don't they, to be so vulnerable to this rapidly changing world situation that we find ourselves in. I mean, for some people, this period in time has been very dark and very scary and very sad. But like in all dark times, there is good to be gained, and that's certainly true that is coming out of this dark time, in that it's like it's caused us to hit the reset button, hasn't it? It's caused us to think more deeply about, well, what are we basing our community and our families, support and security on? What is a better way of thinking about substance and what is valuable? How can we live in a wiser, kinder way in this precious world of ours? And I think that that's what is happening. That's what's coming out of this dark time. It's causing us to have this very important reset, rethink, so that it will not leave us where it found us. We will be able to move forward with greater wisdom, with greater substance, and with a higher vision into our future so that we can live more sustainably, successfully, more lovingly. So as I say, there is great good that is actually coming out of today's situation. And that's what we're going to be doing today, you and I. We're going to be having this rethink. But as part of that rethink, we're going to be looking at spiritual healing and the value that it has to this rethinking process, spiritual healing, how it happens, why it happens, and the wonder of when it does happen. That spiritual healing is actually a very powerful, practical force for good in our lives and in our world today, helping us to replace this global pandemic of fear that has taken so much of our confidence and our assurance with the knowledge of our God-given right to live with dominion and control and not just be victims to everything that the world would throw at us. But while we are having this rethink, I think it's important to remember something that Einstein once said. He said, you can't solve a problem from the level of thinking that caused the problem in the first place. You've got to look at it differently. And that's actually what Christian Science does for us. It's one of its great benefits. It does cause us or help us to think differently about life. It helps us to see a different aspect to life, a spiritual aspect, not just a merely physical one. It helps us to think differently about where the good in our lives actually is coming from. Because Christian Science does have spiritual healing at its core. But how a lone woman in the 1800s, Mary Baker Eddy, came to discover this science of Christianity is also something we're going to be looking at. And we're going to do that for a reason. It's necessary so that you can evaluate for yourselves the pathway that led her to that discovery, and therefore evaluate the worth or that verity of that discovery for yourself, and thus ascertain its potential benefit to help your life, to improve your experience. So this conversation that we're going to have today, it's going to be important. It's also going to be fun, and it's going to be interesting, and, just a joy to be with one another. But the talk will also be recorded, so that if you do want to revisit some of the ideas that you've heard today, or if you want to share them with someone whom they may help as well, then there will be a replay very quickly available, usually within 24 hours, and the details of where to find that will be at the end of the talk today. But I do think right now, I think the starting point is actually to define what we mean by spiritual healing. I mean, that can mean lots of different things to different people. So when I talk about healing spiritually, what am I meaning? What am I talking about? And I think generally it appears as the solving of the human need or human problems through mental means alone, that's not relying on physical or human methods. But it is actually a whole lot more than it appears. It is actually the restoration to our lives of peace and happiness, of order and harmony. So the healing that we're going to be talking about today is just so much more than just mere positive thinking, which is based solely in the human mind. We're going to be talking about a healing that comes through a divine grace, through an understanding of the divine or the spiritual, and the confidence and the well-being that comes with that understanding. So what we're really going to be talking about today is gaining dominion in our lives. And dominions, it's not a word that we hear used very much today, is it? But it should be, because it's just about the exact opposite that we hear far too much of. The word victim. Have dominion is the opposite to being a victim. And I must admit, I had an incident that really helped me to experience that dominion in my own life. But at the same time, it also really showed to me the practicality and the immediacy of spiritual healing in our everyday lives. And it was when I was in my early 20s and I found myself alone one night in a dark back street walking to the car, when a large, strong man grabbed me from behind. And with his arms right around me, his grip was so tight that I was physically powerless to break free. But instead of giving in to fear, I did manage to stay calm, because I realized that I might have been physically powerless, but I was not spiritually powerless. Having been raised in a Christian Science family as I was, where there was not just the acceptance, but the expectation that God was, as the Bible tells us, a very present help in trouble, I called within myself, with all the spiritual strength I could muster, to God for help. A God who I thought of as almighty love. Now, this was not a call of pleading, and it was not a call of vain hope. because I was calling on the God who had saved Moses and the children of Israel from the Egyptian armies, to the God who'd saved Daniel in the lion's den, to the God who had saved Christ Jesus in the tomb. And now I was calling on that same God who I knew was with me then. And I just said, God, help. And you know what happened next? Still awes me to this day when I think about it. That man just dropped his arms to his sides and stood still as though he were paralyzed. And he stayed that way, never moving, until I was safely back in the car. And a lovely after effect of that experience was that not only did I not feel scared and victimized like society so constantly tells us we should feel, I didn't feel that at all. In fact, I felt empowered. I just felt so safe because it was just as the Bible says. God is a very present help in trouble. But a while afterwards, when I was sort of rethinking about that situation, the fullest extent of that healing really occurred to me, because not only was I saved from harm, was I saved from becoming a victim, but that man was saved too, wasn't he? He was saved from becoming a victimizer, from becoming a criminal. We were both loved and cared for. We were both held safe. Now, as I mentioned, I was only a young adult at the time, but that experience really helped me catch a glimpse of this amazingly powerful resource that we all do have available to us. It really helped me to see that I didn't have to be a victim to sudden external aggressive forces that would take away my confidence and my sense of safety and security. None of us do. But, as I said, I was only young at the time. So where did that unearthly confidence come from? Well, for me, always, one of the great blessings about being raised in Christian Science is that you are taught from young to think and reason for yourself, not just blindly believe or accept. We're taught to act rather than react. And Mary Baker Eddy, who, as I said, was the discoverer of Christian Science, she also founded the church. Now, our church was founded by a woman, which, every day still shows me differences that has brought to our religion, our freedom to this way of thinking. But as I say, I was brought up with her ideas. She was a very revolutionary religious thinker and a great healer. She lived in the 1800s and the early 1900s in America, in New England. And her ideas had helped me to understand, somewhat for myself, that message in the Bible, what it was showing to us and what it was proving to us, so that my trust and confidence, my faith on that day actually did have a sound foundation. I mean, she'd come from a very religious family, but she'd had, right from a tiny child, this deep instinctive love of God. She felt a tender relationship to God, a closeness to God, and it seemed to outflow into the way she felt about the people around her, because, again, right from a tiny child, she just seemed to be a natural humanitarian. She just, right throughout her life, just had this deep concern for the welfare of the people around her. And as I say, that was really something that stayed with her right throughout her journey. But her sense of love, a sense of God as love, not just a loving God, which kind of has paternalistic overflows. This was a sense of God as love, as the Bible actually does tell us, but it really caused her to break with some of the more harsh, conventional concepts held by her family's very traditional religious beliefs. Beliefs that held God as being distant and judgmental and harsh. She just couldn't equate those. It was illogical to her. That was so different from what the Bible's message was to her. But even today, traditional religious thinking still holds to this thought that, these healing experiences in the Bible are just something that's a thing of the past, that they're no longer possible today, to today's people in our normal everyday life. And certainly modern thinking, particularly this increasingly secular thinking of the West, that would say that the Bible's message is simply no longer relevant to today's society, but also powerless to provide dependable solutions when material or human methods are available. But to me, always, that book, the Bible, it's just filled with so many records of spiritual healings that were just pure examples of people living their lives with dominion and not being victims to their circumstances. Healing of the human need through spiritual means alone is recorded to have taken place consistently and repeatedly, oftentimes in the face of tremendous physical opposition, right across the centuries that book covers. So we actually do have a tremendous precedent set for us. And to me, that's one of the many reasons why the Bible is still so relevant to us today, still so important, because it details multiple examples of the power of spirituality over physicality. And that kind of healing continued for another 300 years past Jesus. It certainly wasn't exclusive to him or to his era. But then things started to change. Religion started to change. It became increasingly materialistic, ritualized, and politicized, which is the exact opposite to a holy or spiritualized consciousness. And so the understanding of how to heal spiritually, as they had done for so many centuries beforehand, became lost to the world. They simply couldn't understand how those healings had taken place. So they started to be classified as miracles, as something that was extraordinary, but was simply a thing of the past and no longer possible today to normal people under their normal everyday circumstances. But I must admit, I'll admit to you, I find that word miracle a little problematic, particularly if it means some situation where all law and logic is put aside and the impossible is suddenly made possible, or it just happens. I can't actually reasonably or logically accept that. But these healings that took place and are recorded through in the Bible, through these centuries, they're immensely important to us. They're important to us today to understand how did that happen, because there isn't anything we're going through today that they didn't go through in those biblical times and overcome. So it is immensely important that we do understand them. So maybe we have to think about it differently, because, imagine if someone from centuries ago saw a jumbo jet flying through the air. Now, because they simply couldn't understand how such a thing could possibly happen, wouldn't they probably classify this thing that seems so, impossible and unnatural? Wouldn't they probably classify it as a miracle? It's a miracle. Whereas someone from our time, understanding even a little of the laws of aerodynamics, would know that this is totally possible and absolutely natural. Now, that's the difference understanding makes. But thankfully, things are changing. They have been changing. You know, these traditional belief systems are being less believed. They're being reconsidered, thought through more deeply. In fact, in recent decades, right around the world, both from the east to the west, there has been a renewed recognition and practice, even in Christianity, of spiritual healing, which is just so good for the world. But still, over 150 years ago, this deeply religious, deeply spiritually minded woman, Mary Baker Eddy, who was also at the same time, unusually, she was also very strictly scientific and logical in the way that she reasoned. Now, she recognized the significance of what this chain of healing across the centuries was showing to us and what it was proving to us. She recognized not only the dependability and the practicality of spiritual healing, but that the Bible's promise for good, what it was, this ability that it was teaching us and showing to us, its promise for good actually extended throughout all eras and not just a time past. She knew instinctively and naturally, as I'm sure we all do, that of course God is always able to help and heal. God is always a very present help in trouble. Now, if something is being used or relied on consistently and repeatedly right across centuries by all sorts of different people, under all sorts of different circumstances, but with the same successful outcome, then that is not just coincidence or chance. That's not happenstance or fate. They're relying on something dependable, something repeatable, provable, something teachable. They're relying on a law, a principle, or a truth. Now, miracles aren't teachable because they're not understandable. But this ability to heal was being taught and practiced long before Jesus taught his disciples on the shores of the Galilean Sea. In fact, that word disciple means student or apprentice. They were being instructed and inspired as to how to heal. They were being sent out to practice healing. Jesus said, go out and do likewise. He sent them out to heal as he had healed. And they did. Remember, the Bible has them coming back with rejoicing. Obviously, this healing truth was freely available to everyone, everywhere, always. And this lone woman, this spiritually minded, logical thinking woman, Mary Baker Eddy, was the one that recognized that this was happening, that spiritual laws and truths, a principle, must be, it had to be underpinning these repeated healing works. She realized that quite the opposite to being miraculous, that there was actually a science enabling these healings in Christianity. The science of the Christ. It's actually the science of life. It's the truth of life. And she realized, well, if there is this science or this truth that is enabling these healings, then they are as possible and as provable today as they were then. And now through her teachings, her writings, and her tremendous effort for the benefit of mankind, this rediscovered Christian science has been once again made available to the world. It's been made available and possible to us today. And when you think about that one, now that is an amazing thought, that healings like the healings that took place in the Bible, these deeply transforming, saving experiences, are as possible today as they were then. You know, it's really no surprise that she has been voted amongst that great group of thinkers whose words have changed the world. And those words are written down in her globally respected and recognized work, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures. This is the book that allows us to understand how healing happens and to prove it for ourselves. But right now, let's you and I think this through for ourselves. Let's make it relevant to us today, because that's so important. When you think about it, isn't every aspect of life actually based on a set of laws, a principle? Like if we want to do our maths calculations correctly, we have to understand the principle of mathematics, don't we, in order for us to get that check on the page, that right outcome. Now, if we want to fly or build an aeroplane, we have to understand and apply the laws of aerodynamics, don't we, in order for that plane to be able to take off. Can't make it up ourselves. An engineer has to strictly understand and adhere to the laws of physics in order for his buildings to stay up and the bridges not to fall down. When you think about it, it isn't actually the stone and the steel, is it, that is holding those structures in place? It's the invisible, non-physical laws that are holding them upright. Well, over all life, there has to be just such a governing principle, a principle that when we understand and live it, makes our life work rightly for us, you know, makes our relationships happy, makes our children grow and flourish, makes our efforts successful. And to me, that underpinning, overarching, governing principle, that truth underpinning life, to me, that's what that term God means. It's reality. It's the truth of what is, the truth of life. But the Bible has the most profoundly beautiful definition of God. It's in 1 John, where it simply says, God is love. God is love. But that means the governing principle of life, the thing that when we understand and live it in our lives, makes our life work right, brings that peace and well-being to our life, that thing that when understood and lived in our lives, that makes our life work right, is love, divine love, that love is God. And you know, I think we all instinctively know that it is love that makes the world go round, that it is love that makes life worth living, that it is love and only love. A beautifully profound definition of man in the Bible. And that term man means all of us. It's a generic term, it means you and me. So this is a definition of you and me, of who we really are. And again, this one is right in Genesis, in the very first chapter, where it says that man was made in the image and the likeness of God. The image and likeness, or the expression and reflection of God. It's something wonderful to think about. It just has a sense of us being so inseparably connected to God, so inseparably connected to love. It just places God or love right at the center of our identity and our experience. It just starts to raise a sense of ourselves. When we think about ourselves like this, it starts to raise our sense of ourselves just so much higher and holier. But because God is not physical, but is spirit, it spiritualizes our identity. But isn't that also just about the exact opposite image that the world tries to get us to think about is all that is true about ourselves, this flawed, fallen, material blob that is all that we're meant to be? But as we look at some spiritual healings today, I'm sure you come to see the absolute importance of holding to this higher, this more elevated sense of ourselves, this holy concept of ourselves, that it is in that different way of thinking about ourselves actually lies the key to healing, that it really can transform every aspect of our lives. But again, doesn't the Bible show us that time and time again? Doesn't it show us that when the people turned away from physicality, from what all the physical world was telling them, and turned to God, turned to spirituality, turned to heaven, that's when things started to work out rightly for them? So realizing that the Bible was actually revealing to us this spiritual basis to life, and realizing that in that different way of thinking about life, that different concept of life, lay the key to healing, Mary Baker Eddy's entire focus became finding that lost understanding, that true understanding with its lost ability to heal. But like any great shift in societal thinking, and this was a real shift both in science and in religion, it's not easy for anyone making this sort of breaking with traditional thinking. And for her, it was a very hard and very difficult period in her life. But I think, I think it was just this sense of this closeness, this love for God and the love God had for her, but also her recognition of what this discovery could do for her fellow man, that really just kept her moving forward over these hurdles. And in her journey of discovery, in her growing understanding of how healing happens, there were two real breakthroughs. She calls them her falling apple moments, her falling apple ideas. And they are very well-known ideas. The Christian Scientists in the audience here will certainly know them. They're very well documented. But for what we're talking about today, they're actually pivotal in just seeing how she came to her conclusions. But they're also fascinating. I mean, it's part of her trying to find a cure for her own illness. I mean, she'd been chronically ill right throughout her life. She tried many things. Now, the late 1800s, there was a load of alternate practices and therapies, and she tried a lot of them, mostly with no success, some with limited success. She'd get better for a while, but then it'd come back again. But one that she did stay with for a bit longer was homeopathy. Now, you may know that homeopathy is where smaller and smaller amounts of a drug are given in order to effect a cure. But finally, in one extreme case, pills containing only sugar were given to the patient, and yet the patient still recovered. Now, seeing this, she realized that, well, obviously it wasn't the drug that brought about the cure, because there was none, but it was the patient's faith in the drug. Now, this was the human mind at work on itself here. And so she started to realize not only the mental nature of sickness, but also of health. And the second breakthrough came again, enormously pivotal point in her discovery of how spiritual healing is happening. Very well documented, very well known. It was when she suffered an accident that seemed to have dire consequences. She had extreme internal injuries, so much so that the doctors just felt they could not help her. She was in great pain and suffering. She was being looked after, but she was left alone with her Bible. Now, you've got to think about that moment. There is absolutely no human help left in this world for her. In fact, she herself seemed to think she was passing on. She talks about standing in the confines of human existence within the shadows of Death Valley. So she herself felt she was passing on. And in those moments, those deep, searching moments when all she has is her Bible and her God, she said she suddenly had a great insight, a flash of understanding. And what she says she saw was she saw God's allness, that God was all the life and mind there was, and that she existed within that divine life. And at that moment, that purely spiritual, holy moment, the effects of the accident simply left her, and she got up out of bed and walked. Now, this was not the human mind at work here. This was something entirely different. This was, as Jesus, the master healer, had said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And afterwards, I find her response to this experience, this really quite fascinating, because at first she didn't understand what she'd seen or how it had healed her. But what she didn't do, firstly, she didn't classify it as a miracle. She didn't turn that room into a shrine. She didn't start a pilgrimage up the street to that house. She didn't do any of those things. But what she did actually reminds me of something that I saw when I was young. When I was young on Australian television, there was an old American scientist, Professor Julius Sumner Miller. He was a physical scientist. Of course, he had the Einstein hair and the obligatory mad eyebrows. And Julius Sumner Miller every week would come on and show us kids an experiment and the results of that experiment. And to be honest, to this day, I cannot remember one of those experiments, but I can remember what he said to us every week after every experiment. He said to us, "Why is it so? How did that outcome just happen? Why did that just happen? Why is it so?" He made us think about it, not just go, "Oh, look how amazing that was." That was unacceptable. Why is it so? We had to think about it. And that was the tact that Mary Baker Eddy took. But Professor Sumner Miller could not have discovered the science of Christianity because his science was matter-based. And a traditional religionist could not have discovered the science of Christianity because their worship is based in the mystery and the miracle of their devotion. It took the logic and the inspiration, the reason and the revelation to discover the science of Christianity. It took both. And that very unusual combination is why I think she was the one that was led to discover, or was enabled to discover, this science of Christianity. And over the next 3 years, her entire focus was figuring out why is it so. And as these laws, these divine laws, these spiritual laws that were enabling or basing these spiritual healings in Christianity, as they started to be revealed to her, so she realized that quite differently to the way we think about ourselves, our real identity and substance as part of God's allness is actually spiritual, not physical. And that it was in this different way of thinking about ourselves, this reconceiving of ourselves, or as Jesus put it, this being born again, it was in this reconception of ourselves lay the key to healing. Now, I've got to be honest, that was a really big thought she had. What she understood was a true revelation. And the only way that I can catch even the tiniest glimpse of this vast understanding is a little maths analogy that does help me. It may help you. I'll tell you what it is. I want you to all, whether you're online or on the phone, I want you just to imagine a white, clean sheet of paper. All right? Pure white sheet of paper. Can you all see it? Good. Now, on that piece of paper is written 2 + 2 = 4. Can you see that? All right? Piece of paper with 2 + 2 = 4 on it. It's a truth, isn't it? It's a perfect truth. Can you see it? Okay. Now take away the piece of paper. Can you still see that truth? It's still perfect, isn't it? But it's also totally non-physical. It's a truth. It's a truth that has always been true. It always will be true. It is absolutely perfect. And it is totally indestructible. I mean, you can't, wear it out. It doesn't age. You can't blow it up. It can't catch a virus. And it is absolutely existent within and governed by its perfect principle. It's spiritual, it's perfect, and it's eternal. Well, to each one of us, there is just such a perfect truth. An identity, a spiritual identity, that when we take away all the beliefs and fears that we hold about ourselves, when we take away all the beliefs and fears that the world holds for us, when we take away the burdens and hardships of human history, when we take away all that human thinking about ourselves, and we just get down to, who are we really? How does God see us? There is just a perfect truth to each one of us, a truth that is spiritual, that is perfect, and that is eternal. That is that is who you really are. And isn't that what the Bible is saying when it says, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are unseen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are unseen are eternal. And her discovery of this spiritual basis to life allowed her to consistently and repeatedly heal both the sick of mind and of body, and entirely through spiritual means alone, just like Jesus had done. Now, her healings of chronic illness, of incurability, of deafness, blindness, of insanity, even severe deformity, well-documented healings. Look, they make for astounding reading. She brought the spiritual truth to the human problem, and the truth made them free. And one of her healings that never ceases to amaze me, it amazes me not just because of the physical change that came about, but because of the amazing simplicity of her prayers. And these are her own words. This is in a fabulous book. If you can get that anywhere, it's Mary Baker Eddy, Christian Healer. It lists her healings, and it also, she's talking to her students all the way about how healing happens, how she heals. But these are her own words. She says, I was walking along the street and saw this cripple with one knee drawn up to his chin, the other limb drawn up the other way up his back. And I came up to him and read on a piece of paper pinned on his shoulder, help this poor cripple. Well, I had no money to give him. So I whispered in his ear, God loves you. And he got up perfectly straight and well. How profound must have been her understanding, her sense of divine love, that it could transform any situation that was unloving. And the results, the things that were revealed to her during that very important search and discovery period, are written down in her book, her teaching piece, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. That is the book that contains the words that have changed the world. It's the book that contains the ideas of that sacred knowledge of healing that help us to understand and gain that sacred knowledge for ourselves. And certainly worldwide, it has transformed countless numbers of people's lives worldwide, leading them into happier, healthier, holier ways of thinking and living. And certainly the healing that it inspires continues through to this day. And I just wanted to tell you the very first sentence in that book, in the whole book, the very first sentence in preface. And I want to do that for a reason. That sentence is, to those leaning on the sustaining infinite. Now that's God. So to those leaning on God, to those leaning on the sustaining infinite, today is big with blessings. You know, there's been so many healings recorded by people in need, just catching a glimpse of the potential and promise for good contained in those words and being healed. And I actually do know that's true. I know it because my father was one of them. When he was in his early teens, he was diagnosed with what the doctors said was an incurable and fatal illness, something called disseminated sclerosis. Now, his mother was a simple woman. She was a country girl. But still, to her, that word, incurable, simply meant the doctors couldn't cure it. And having more faith in God than man, she kept searching for an answer. She didn't give up. And finally, one day, someone suggested to her, why don't you go and see a Christian Science practitioner? And she did. She found one in the local area, and she went and visited this lady, Mrs. Wilson. And Mrs. Wilson introduced her to science and health. Now, a Christian Science practitioner, if you don't know, is someone who is available to the general public to bring about prayer-based solutions to life's problems, whatever we may be facing. And apparently my mother and my grandmother almost straight away felt that she'd found the answer. So she brought that book and she took it home to her son. But by then, he was completely paralyzed. He was deaf, was partially blind. He could just see night from day. And because it had hit him during his growing period of his life, one leg was several inches shorter than the other. But still, even in that state, he asked her to prop that book up on his chest so he could read it. You know, even then, he was still fighting for himself. He was not giving up either. But all that he could read that first day was just that first sentence. To those leaning on the sustaining infinite, today, right now, is big with blessings. Well, for him, those words were like a ray of hope in the darkness. And he felt so inspired. Now, the next day, he found he could read a whole page. And the next day after that he could read more than 2. And the healing had begun. And over the next 6 months, he kept reading that book. And along the way, all the symptoms, including the paralysis and the hearing and the sight loss, completely corrected. And even the shortening of the leg was completely restored to normal. And the healing remained permanent. My father's concept of himself had shifted from one of material misery and limitation to the limitless, joyous freedom of life in spirit, of spiritual life. For my father also, God proved to be a very present help in trouble. Now, when we hear about healings like that, and I grew up knowing that healing, having that in our family, but when we hear about them, it's wonderful, but we have to think it through too, don't we? We have to make it our own. We have to think, why is it so? How did that happen? Because in both the instances of myself and my father, there was no human helper available. There was, as I mentioned, nobody around to help me when I was grabbed in the dark. And the doctors had long given up on being able to help my father. So what's going on here? What was the healing, saving agent at work in our rescues? And frankly, I know what it was. I know what it was for both of us. It's not a mystery. It was the understanding gained from reading those 2 books, the Bible and Science and Health. Because what do books contain? Books contain ideas, don't they? They help us to understand things. They help us to make sense of the world. And to understand anything correctly is a bit like doing your math calculations with a correct understanding. You can, get a correct outcome. But to get that correct outcome, we have to first start, don't we, with a right premise, a correct concept, and then we can expect a correct outcome. Now, this correct concept that we've been talking about today, that God is always able to help and heal, God is always this present help in trouble, is a bit like starting your calculations with a right understanding. By turning to God, this divine principle of life that is love. So by turning from spirituality, from physicality to spirituality, we find the spiritual truths and ideas, the correct concepts that solve the human situation, that human situation, the human problems. A bit like turning to the principle of mathematics. If we have a problem with our calculations, we do find the correct truth, the facts of the matter that then correct that calculation. But isn't it a wonder that it isn't something as clinical as maths? That is our God. Our God is love, divine love. The principle, the governing principle of our life is love. And you can actually see that because, when you apply any truth, whether it's maths or aerodynamics or any aspect of life, when you apply it correctly, when you understand the truth of the matter, what do you get? You get harmony. Things work rightly. You get perfection. It would seem the design of the universe, the motivating power of this universe is love. And you can actually see that even in our own journeys, because as we are gaining this sense of our spiritual basis to ourselves, this sense of our own inseparability to God, to love, as that is growing within us, we are learning more and more that we do not have to be victims to everything that the world would throw at us, but that we can exercise our God-given right, our God-given control and dominion over problems of every sort. And this exercise of dominion and control, of good over evil, of spirituality over physicality, is again a constant theme throughout the Bible. So I don't want to give a sense here that this is some unnatural divine intervention, some miraculous laying aside of all natural law or normalcy, because it isn't that at all. But that an improvement in our thinking, a spiritualization of our thinking, brings about an improvement, a spiritualization of our life, our experience. That's not unnatural, is it? And maybe that point, if you get that point, that can be your falling apple concept that you take home with you today. Because is it unnatural that when a right idea replaces a wrong idea, that harmony is restored? I mean, is that unnatural? Actually, no, it's perfectly natural. This transformation is as natural as the light of the sunrise replacing the darkness of the night and warming and lighting the earth. It was the idea of the divine presence of care and that I relied on in my time of trouble that brought about a safe, harmonious outcome. It was the idea of the sustaining infiniteness of divine life, of spiritual life, that lit up my father's thought and was the start of him experiencing days big with blessings. This idea of our own inseparable connection to divine goodness and care, our own inseparable connection to divine love, is available to everyone, everywhere, always. It's available to you and me here and now. It's available to our families. Indeed, it's available to everyone's families everywhere. And I've got to tell you, as a mother, this idea of it being available not only to our own families, but to the families around us as well, I mean, that always has really warmed my heart. Because, I mean, when my girls were little, we lived overseas. We live in an expatriate community. You know, I got two girls, and my husband and the girls, we all moved overseas for a couple of years, and we lived very closely with this community. You know, in fact, we worked and played, and the kids even went to school together. So it was a very, you know, a close relationship. The kids went to the same schools and the same play groups. But one day, one little fellow came home very unwell, and he was diagnosed with having the mumps. Now, the mumps, as you might know, is very contagious, but it also has this other aspect to it, in that it can make men infertile. And as a lot of the couples there were just young couples starting their families, you know, this was a huge concern to them. In fact, it started to get blown up into this great big fear and became the constant topic of conversation. Every conversation was just fueled with this great fear of what could happen. But for me, I knew I had an option. I could, you know, join the conversation and panic like everybody else, or I could just go to God. And with that very simple option, I just thought, okay, Beth, what does God know about the situation? And the sense that came immediately was the child's innocency. How could this pure, sweet, loving little boy harm anyone? It just simply wasn't possible. In fact, that little guy was such a sweetie. He was a real blessing to us all. And with that different view, that holier, more loving view, consciousness, all of a sudden, I just saw God's love not only for that little guy, but for all of us. Each and every one of us just feel that complex like the sunshine. There was just so much love and goodness going on that it just filled even the corners and the dark places of fear. The Bible tells us that in God we live and move and have our being. And in that holy moment, I actually saw that that was literally true. Well, no element of evil or anything bad could possibly enter such a heavenly atmosphere. Well, that was about as impossible as the darkness infecting the light. And from that moment on, the fear just stopped, and I never heard it voiced again. And in fact, within a day or two, that little guy was back to his normal sweet self, quite well and happy, without another single person catching that virus. It simply stopped, and peace reigned. Now again, there was no use in falling for fear here. The solution didn't lie there. The solution lay in understanding the truth of the situation, the truth that divine love is this ever-present, all-powerful spiritual law, and that this all-powerful law of love counteracts the suggestion that anything else could be going on, that there was some other power. It was the truth known and the love felt that brought about the healing. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Now, Christ Jesus made that statement, didn't he, over 2,000 years ago? But it's still true today. He was constantly conscious of his own inseparability to God, constantly knowing and feeling love. Now, in such a an unwavering spiritual consciousness. No suggestions of want, of danger, of sickness, of evil, even of death, could overshadow his clear understanding that the solution to all human need is always with us, ever at hand. So where the human view saw want and great poverty, Christ Jesus saw the abundance of divine resources. Where the human view saw sickness and suffering, Christ Jesus saw the ever-operative laws of health and harmony. Where the human view saw death, Christ Jesus saw God, eternal life, including within its own allness all true identity. He kept his inner grace no matter what was going on around him. And we were talking once in Sunday school about how he did that. You know, I teach the teenagers, and we're just trying to figure, how did he keep that sense of peace, that inner grace, given what was always going on around him, you know, the sickness and the crowds clamoring to touch him? How did he keep his peace? And we didn't really know, but we knew it was important to think it through. So we were just quiet for a moment and just thought about it. And the answer that came was to get 2 pieces of white paper. All right, I get you to imagine it now. 2 pieces of pure white, clean paper. And on one, and I want you to imagine this, on this one page, write 2 and 2 equals 3. And then 2 and 2 equals 5. And then, you know, 2 and 2 equals 24. And then, you know, the kids got all excited. They wrote 2 and 2 equals 695. And we filled that page full of this human thinking about the truth. There was even 2 plus 2 with no answer at all. And then on the other page, the pure white, clean page, we simply wrote 2 plus 2 equals 4. And that's when we realized how he did it. He kept his thought entirely off that human page of thinking and entirely focused on the truth. And I often think, what would be written on Jesus's page? And I think it would be simply that God is all. God is all. And if we, particularly now during these times when the media is so clamoring with all this human thoughts and comments about life, if we start to develop or to cultivate this pure spiritual focus, wouldn't we too start to cultivate an inner grace that could not be touched no matter what was going on around us? Certainly, that seemed to be the way Mary Baker Eddy did it. Over her life, she just developed from that initial sense of her closeness to God, the concept of God as love. She just developed this unwavering focus. What does God know? What is God? And that did allow her to heal as she had healed. But for us, can we trust, or can we depend on this spiritual view of life, this understanding the spiritual basis to life under all circumstances? You know, say in a critical situation, can we, do you think, rely on this spiritual view of life as much as we can on the human view? Can we rely on spiritual means rather than material means? Can we rely on God more than man? And that is something that we all must come to in our own way and in our own time. But I've got to tell you, I am learning more and more never to underestimate the transforming power that this spiritual sense of life can bring, this transformation it can bring into our experience. When I received a call from my daughter one day, now she works out in the forest of Tasmania. Now, Tasmania is an island state way off the south of the Australian mainland. And she said that she had been out surveying a steep hillside. And after all day, after much walking and up and down this very severe incline, she said now at the end of the day, as she rang me, she was suddenly experiencing something very frightening and unknown. She said she was suddenly experiencing extreme chest pains, excruciating chest pains, shortness of breath, and she was now so exhausted that she couldn't get herself off that hill back to the vehicle, and there was just no help anywhere near. So what I heard when I took that call was what sounded to me like my 27-year-old daughter having a heart attack. For a moment, the fear was almost overwhelming. But I had to put all that sense of self aside because there was no help to be had in fear. I had to stop being human mother and I had to be practitioner because she needed help immediately. And that was the most immediate, powerful, practical help I could give her. So I just wordlessly went to God and I just said, show me what I need to know here. And divine love answered immediately, loudly and slowly and clearly so I could get it. The query came, do you think her life is in danger of ending? Well, with all I had ever learned growing up in Christian Science about life and our inseparability to God, I had lost to a greater extent the sense that we actually ever do stop, but that we are as an ongoing as any truth. So I tentatively answered, no, I don't. But then as though to reinforce my conviction, the query came, do you think she's about to die? And again, but this time with more conviction, because I really didn't think her life was about to stop, because her life and identity were a part of God's life and identity. God would have to stop for her to stop. So again, I said, no, I don't. But then the sounds on the end of the phone were just heart-wrenching. But more loudly and more forcefully than the sound of any human suffering, the voice of God said to me, do you think these symptoms can end her life? By then, the sense of her ongoing, indestructible spiritual identity had been so reinforced within me, had been so accruing within me, that the thought that these symptoms could possibly touch her spiritual, eternal, divine identity, her life that was lived in God, the thought that these symptoms could affect that in any way almost seems silly. She was spiritual and she was perfect and she was eternal, and I knew it. So without a shadow of doubt or fear, I was able to say, absolutely not. And with that, a sense of her omnipotent safety just filled my consciousness. And in that moment, when the fear broke, all the symptoms simply left her. And my daughter walked off that hillside, safe and well. And she has remained that way. You shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Now, I hope you today have been gaining a greater understanding of how this precious thing called spiritual healing does happen, and your own absolute ability to demonstrate that. I hope that you've been gaining a greater understanding of your own inseparable connection to divine love, to God's care and love of you. I hope the ideas that I've shared about Mary Baker Eddy, about her life and her ideas, her writings, has inspired you to look into those ideas more deeply, because they truly are life transforming and they're fascinating. And I hope that you leave here today with a greater sense of your own right to live with dominion and not be a victim to everything that the world would throw at you. But I am going to right now give you some homework. All right, this is homework, and I want you to do this every night for 2 weeks. I want you to do it just before you go to sleep and the moment you wake up. All right, and this is what I want you to do. I want you to say to yourself, I am spiritual, I am perfect, I am eternal. Now, can you say that with me now? I am spiritual, I am perfect, I am eternal. And now I want you to say it with your whole heart and whole head and whole feelings. I am spiritual. I am perfect. I am eternal. So every night as you go to sleep and every morning you wake up, you remind yourself of what God knows about you. Keep it up for 2 weeks, and at the end of that 2 weeks, you just watch the change in thinking, and then you remember it for the rest of your life. And I just wanted to leave you some beautiful final promises from the Bible and Science and Health. The Bible, Romans, who shall separate us from the love of Christ, the love of God? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine? Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, shall be able to separate us from the love of God. And from Science and Health, the depth, breadth, height, might, majesty, and glory of infinite love fill all space. That is enough. God bless you. Thank you. And as you'll see, here's some of the details that will be sent to you. So if you want to revisit some of these ideas, or if you want to share them, here are the details. There is the prayerthatheals.org, and there's christianscienceCoronadelmar.com. Now, these are the two places that you'll find the link that'll go straight to this replay, which will be up very shortly. But for right now, God bless you. And thank you for being with me.